Okay. Well, I think we'll get started, and then I'll keep tending to the people who are signing up last minute. But welcome everyone to our next installment of our free public online Zoom lectures. This is a event series that we started during the pandemic for obvious reasons, and it's been a great success. So we've just continued it. We've been doing about one lecture a month now for, I think, about a year and a half. And we're going to keep doing it even as we return to normalcy, if we ever return to normalcy. By the way, I'm Jason Petticone. I'm the president and co-founder of the Institute, and I'm very happy to welcome you all here, and very grateful to Dr. Kiki Karoglou for this fascinating talk and topic. So Dr. Karoglou is an archaeologist specializing in classical art, ancient Greek myth, and the reception of classical antiquity, and the history of collections. She's been associate curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she curated acclaimed expositions on Pergamon and the Hellenistic Kingdoms of the ancient world, and another one called Dangerous Beauty, Medusa in Classical Art. That was in 2019. Currently, she's a visiting lecturer at the Hellenic College of the Holy Cross in Boston, but she's also taught at the University of Toronto, the College of New Jersey, Princeton, and she's held fellowships and internships at the Getty, the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, the Princeton Art Museum, the Acropolis Museum in Greece, and participated in numerous archaeological excavations in the Mediterranean, and published and lectured extensively on the history of ancient art and archaeology. And she originally received her PhD in classical art and archaeology from Princeton University, where I also have mine, but I don't think we overlapped, although I feel a certain kinship with her because of that. So thank you so much, Kiki, for being here today to tell us about narratives of madness in classical art. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Oh, thank you, Jason. Thank you for this kind of introduction. And yes, we didn't coincide, but we've known each other for many years. And I was glad when you asked me to invite me to participate in this public lecture series, because that's my main interest, like bringing the classics to a wider audience than the narrow confines of academia. Really appreciate it. So I will start sharing my presentation. I'm letting you all know, and you won't see me for a little bit, and then I'll come back to you for the Q&A. That's what we have at the end. Let's see. So my talk today draws upon my current work on visual narratives of madness in classical art, and not only that, but also their post-classical reiterations. By focusing on these images of madness, it brings an art historical perspective to the discussion of cognitive disabilities and atypical psychologies in antiquity, which has relied primarily on the analysis of literary sources. This consists mainly, the sources consists mainly, of course, of Homer, the Homeric epic, Athenian tragedy and comedy, and the Hippocratic medical corpus, about 60 preserved works. Recently, discussions on the topic are informed, in addition, by sociology and the history of medicine. Myths tell stories a society finds important about the natural world, ideas of the divine, and human customs and emotions. It thus may surprise a modern audience to learn that by the end of the 5th century BC in ancient Greece, more than 40 myths are known to have involved narratives of madness. Only few of these tales are illustrated in art, mainly Attic vase paintings of the 6th and 5th centuries and South Italian ones of the 4th century BC. As to typically, similar to today, madness was socially construed as an odd and inexplicable conduct that conflicted with customary modes of behavior. Already by the 5th century, at the end of this century, distinction was made between mental illness and divine madness, what the ancient Greeks called mania, or mania in English. The first was considered a bodily ailment due to natural causes, an illness caused by excess black bile, and diagnosis attributed first to the famous doctor Hippocrates. The insane were prescribed various cures, ranging from taking hellebore, which was a plant staple of practical medicine, to temple incubation. The term mania refers more to the irrational, however, than the pathological, and its connotations range from passionate manifestations of emotions, disturbances of the conscience, different modalities of thought, and perceptions of reality. Mania was considered supernatural in origin. Frequently induced by an angry god, it was seen as a form of divine punishment for an act of hubris or sacrilege. Epilepsy, known as also the sacred disease, blurred these two categories. Ancient authors distinguished between religious ecstasy, usually connected with Dionysus, divine madness, and folly caused by one induced drunkenness. A historic example is narrated by Herodotus, and that of King Cleomenes I of Sparta. So Cleomenes engineered, as many of you know, the removal of his fellow king Demaratus, because Sparta had a dual kingship, by bribing the Delphic oracle. When his deceit was discovered, he fled to Thessaly. The Spartans reinstated him, but soon afterward, he went insane and committed suicide. Herodotus says that Cleomenes had already, and you see that the relevant passages on your screen, Herodotus says that Cleomenes had already not been entirely in his right mind, and on his return from exile, a sickness of madness fell upon him. Any Spartan that he happened to meet, he would hit in the face with his staff. Herodotus goes on to say, the Spartans themselves say that Cleomenes' madness arose from no divine agent, but from that, by consorting with Scythians, he became a drinker of strong wine, and the madness came from this. Going back to how classical scholars have treated the subject, of course, the seminal book here is The Greeks and the National of 1951 by E.R. Dodds, who categorized the different iterations of divine madness. The main ones as prophetic, connected to the god Apollo, ritual, of course, as we said before, it's like the frenzied ecstasy connected with Dionysus, poetic with the Muses, and erotic, Aphrodite and Eros, connected with Aphrodite and love, of course, and Eros and sexual desire. Among of the deities that caused both caused mental problems and also provided remedies and healing for them were, of course, Dionysus, Hera, Athena, and Pan, the god of nightmares, the god that induces panic, which is also the modern English term comes from. Of course, Cybele and the Corybantes, and the Erinyes, or Furies, the embodiment of hereditary guilt. In numerous myths, vengeful gods drive individuals into madness that leads to violence with grim consequences. And we'll see examples of the infanticides committed by Heracles and Athamas, or the suicide of Ajax. Now, briefly, how the literary sources treat the subject. Tragedy and comedy treat madness quite differently. In tragedy, it is a divine intervention that causes heroes to lose their capacity for reason. As tragedy developed, the intervention of the gods lost much of its religious significance, and therefore a character's disposition became an implicit psychological category that can lead to madness. And Sophocles, as we'll see later, was one of the pioneers in that direction. I should stress that no genuine madman appears on the stage of comedy, though. true madness was not considered amusing, on the contrary. Comedic characters are burlesques of subjects properly tragic, not ordinary people suffering from mental illness. Their insanity is feigned, usually caused by some bile imbalance or other natural causes. So their madness is not introduced in the play as intrinsically funny, as for instance drunkenness is, but as a device of rhetorical exaggeration and is used for comic effect. So that leads us to glimpse the symptoms and actions of a madman only indirectly. So we know from various references that the insane were detested, excluded, and considered dangerous. At the same time, they were treated with awe and were thought to have special powers. And these two types of conduct were deemed typical of the demented: violence and roaming around aimlessly. Real-life behaviors of the afflicted, as well as actions towards the insane, are not depicted as we wouldn't expect, unsurprisingly, in the arts of the classical world of antiquity. But also, it's interesting to note that the literary stereotypes of the wandering or stone-throwing madman are also absent. So that leads us to the two main questions. How do artists visualize this complex psychological phenomenon? And what is the vocabulary of the, in other words, what is the vocabulary of the visual language of madness? Of course, this is just a preliminary overview, it's a survey, and I'm going to touch upon some of these mythical narratives and their presentations, but it's a much broader topic that cannot be presented in the confines of this lecture. This is something I'm working on. So, most myths involving madness are associated with parricide, presenting insanity as either a cause or a consequence of murdering one's kin. They are deeply connected with the theme of atavistic guilt that preventing descendants in the bloodline from ever escaping the stain of atrocities committed by their ancestors, even if they are far removed in time, place, and culpability. In ancient Greece, the idea of inherited guilt and deferred punishment was based on the family and the genus, the clan, as the unit of morality. As Dodd suggests, it probably originated from the observation of criminals going unpunished in real life. Sons inherited their fathers' moral debts, which eventually were paid off. This connection of crime and punishment that even gods could not break was called moira, or cosmic justice, or in other words, used for the much fate or fates. The story of Croesus and Pythia famously illustrates this notion of tainted blood. In response to an inquiry by the Lydians about their king, the priestess declared, and you see the relevant passage on the screen, "No one may escape his lot, not even a god. Croesus has paid for the sin of his ancestor of the 5th generation before, who was led by the guile of a woman to kill his master, though he was one of the guards of the Heraclidae, and who took to himself the royal state of the master, to which he had no right." It goes on to say, and it was the wish of Loxias that the evil lot of Sardis fell in the lifetime of Croesus' sons, not his own, but he could not deflect the fates. So it's pretty clear. The deities of revenge, the primary deities of revenge, were the Erinyes or Furies. These were the avenging ghosts of the murdered, in a way, the personified curses of the victim's kin, charged with upholding moral order, especially in cases of murder and perjury. No prayer, no sacrifice, and no tears can move them or protect the object of their persecution. Being more ancient divinities than the Olympian gods, and thus not under the direct rule of Zeus, they dwelt in the deep darkness of Tartarus, dreaded by both gods and men. The number was initially unspecified, but later limited to 3. They were called Alecto, relentless, Megara, resentful, and Tisiphone, the one who avenges murder. But they were so feared that their names were rarely spoken. Aeschylus was probably the first to visualize the Erinyes, since there is no artistic representation of them before 458 BCE, when the Oresteia was first produced. And of course, you all know the Oresteia is a Syrian saga that examines the sins of a family over several decades. The plays investigate major themes as the justification of vengeance, the possibility of finding justice in retaliation, and the role of judicial democracy at work, themes that continue to resonate nearly 2.5 millennia after the trilogy was first performed. So Aeschylus describes the Furies as Gorgon-like women, their bodies covered with black garments, or some of, as call them black, serpents twined in their hair and twisted around their arms, and blood dripping from their eyes. Euripides and other later poets describe them as winged beings. So this appearance that they are having in Aeschylus was more or less retained by poets and artists of later times. On the vase scenes, they're usually winged, carrying a goat, whip, or torch in their hands. Their presence signals a story of punishment and revenge. In most cases, they appear in connection with the persecution of Orestes for killing his mother Clytemnestra to avenge the murder of his father Agamemnon. And I'm showing you here on the screen one of the rare depictions of Orestes' matricide is on a South Italian red figure amphora of about 330 at the Getty, where you see he's grabbing her hair and it's about to, and she's bleeding next to him. And at the very top right corner, you see one singular Erinyes threatening him with a snake. However, the Erinyes make in the literature, they make the more memorable appearance as the chorus of the Eumenides, the third play of Aeschylus' tragedy, in which Clytemnestra's ghost summons them to exact retribution from her son Orestes. They are evoked throughout the first two plays, but only Orestes, however, begins to see them as in his mind at the end of the libation bearers. And I'm showing you here a passage from that play, which exactly so is the scene where he says that I can see them, they are not my mind. So this is delusion, he's in his delusional state, so you can see that these are not imagined, these are real beings after me. And then this is interesting here, it's like I highlighted the lines of the choruses. It is what gives us the etiology, I mean, the cause of his temporary madness is the blood that's still fresh on your hands, is the cause of your disorder. And then, of course, goes to say that, oh, they're horrible, looking at the eyes are dripping blood. Among the punishments of the Erinyes enumerated by Orestes, as we said, are madness, sometimes in the text called also Lysa, and nightmares, or phobos nykton in the Greek. Now, an Apulian crater of the middle of the 4th century preserves a striking representation of another scene in Aeschylus' Eumenides, in which Orestes takes refuge at the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. And you see him here clinging at the Ophalos, the navel stone that displayed in a small temple-like building. So look closely, he's surrounded by Erinyes, and here, you can see it here, and then I have a close-up of the detail. Who lay sleeping on the ground. A priestess flees the scene in astonishment. You see this figure here on the left. These were probably conceived as a chorus. This like reminds us of the scene in the play that I mentioned before. Because they are portrayed in almost identical way, with white hair, black skin, and white belted tunics. Their bodies are rendered through the contrasting forms of the white dress and hair and the use of the gray-black paint on the black background. This painterly effect, the theatrical tone of the scene, are enhanced by the so-called, art historians call this the Grenache Technique, a style of Apulian vase painting, where figures are painted with added colors on the black surface of the vase, of the vessel. So this, as a side note, these polychrome, almost three-dimensional vases were very popular, became popular and were widely exported from Italy in the second half of the second half of the 4th century BC. But what makes the representation of these arenas very noteworthy and unusual is the combination of the black skin and the white hair. Aeschylus refers to them as being black, as I mentioned before, but probably the meaning there in the text is that they are dressed in black garments. Although it is possible that there were staged having black skin in the original production of the play. Moreover, Apollo calls them old women, ancient girls. An implication perhaps that they were shown with white hair, a detail uniquely represented in this vase painting. Aeschylus describes them as disgusting and hideous, with eyes dripping blood. Whereas often in vase paintings, they are represented as good-looking or fine-looking, as for instance, this Apulian, again, crater in the Louvre of the early 4th century. So what you will see here, you will see Orestes being purified by Apollo, while the Clytemnestra, and I saw you here the detail, tries to awake the sleeping Furies. As you see, and similarly to other mythological terrifying beings such as Medusa, their imagery, their representation is not only influenced by the idealizing trends of classical Greek art of the 5th century, but also because in a way, people think that maybe perhaps improving their appearance in the visual arts was an attempt to placate the Furies. And that was definitely the case with renaming them Eumenides, the kind goddesses, and equating them with the Semnephe, the venerable goddesses that were worshipped near the Areopagus in Athens, the city's supreme court of law. Now, the subject kind of gets forgotten in the Renaissance and regains popularity in the late 18th and 19th century, especially with French academic paintings, and I'm going to show you the Bouguereau painting. I'm showing you here a drawing, a black and white drawing by Louis Laffitte of Orestes pursued by the Furies. You can hear the inversion. It's like it's Orestes that is now sleeping and the Furies attacking him. Either probably the painter was to see that he's visualized them into his delusion of state. And of course, this is again, the rest is pursued by the Furies by Bouguereau. This was, or alternatively called the remorse of Orestes, when we see the Furies encircling Orestes was trying to close his ears, and at his back, we see the murdered Clytemnestra falling back. Or even this one, which I find very interesting, is even in the early 20th century, we have the John Singer Sargent painted this scene in in the stair, in the gallery of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, what was a special commission. And one of the mythological paintings is this depiction of Orestes and pursued by the Furies. As we said, the hubris of Mendenkar's divine wrath, but another force that drives mortals mad is divine jealousy. These archaic thought patterns interlink religion, morality, and justice. Divine jealousy in Greek phonos becomes moralized as nemesis, as rightness, indignation, while too much success results in complacency, chorus, which in turn leads to arrogance in word and deed, hubris. So Hera and Dionysus are the two gods most closely associated with inflicting insanity as a form of punishment. Zeus often betrayed his marriages to Hera, and Hera in turn persecuted and punished his lovers and offsprings. Even Dionysus himself, son of Zeus with the mortal Semele, was not immune to Hera's anger. Some later sources allege that Hera inflicted Dionysus with a madness that set him wandering through Egypt and Syria for years, until he came across the earth goddess Cybele, who cured him. However, the mythological archetype of the man or the king driven mad by the gods was Athamas, king of Thebes. Now, Athamas was one of the 7 sons of King Aeolus of Thessaly and brother to Sisyphus and Salmoneus, which I'm going to mention a little later. These were, along with other inhabitants of Tartarus, like Ixion and Tantalus, are rarely depicted in Greek art, not very often. The story of Athamas, which predates the Argonaut saga, is related in the Bibliotheki, the library, a Roman compendium of early Greek myths misattributed to Apollodorus, Hellenistic author. Hera was angry with Athamas for receiving from Hermes the infant Dionysus at the bequest of Zeus and bringing him up as a girl to escape her jealous wrath. As a consequence, the goddess drove Athamas mad. The king hunted his older son, Learchus, as a deer and shot him dead with an arrow, and forced his wife, Ino, to cast herself and the younger son, Melicertes, into the sea. In Greek art, there are representations of Hermes bringing the infant Dionysus to Athamas, but none of the calamitous demise of Athamas's family. Like many other Greco-Roman narratives of madness, this figures only in the arts of later periods. And among the earliest are engravings for book illustrations of 16th and 17th century editions of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And I'm showing you here on the screen the frontispiece and 2 of the plates from a book, the second edition of 1606, produced in Antwerp in Holland by Antonio. And the engravings are the drawings are by Antonio Tedeschi, the Florentine artist of the second half of the 16th century. This, as you see here, this is from a cycle. We see on the top right Juno speaking to the Furies, which are imagined to live in the underworld, or you see the 3-headed Kerberos guarding the gates of hell. And here on the bottom, you see one of them named Tisiphone, actually instigating mad insanity, making both the queen and the king mad. And then the third plate is the scene where Athamas kills his older son and throws Melicertes into the sea. As you can also, the Latin is somewhere you can read the titles from the Latin inscribed in the illustration. Another of these engravings for the book edition for the Metamorphoses is this by Gottfried Mees, a famous painter of the second half of the 17th century, which shows Athamas tearing apart his children. You see them here. The subject was also popular in neoclassical art, and I'm showing you here as an example a large-scale marble sculpture of the British neoclassical sculptor John Flaxman, entitled The Fury of Athamas, now in the National Trust collection in England. So both these and the previous drawing by Mess depict a dramatic moment when Athamas grabs his son, Learchus, from his mother and smashes him against a wall or the ground in a fit of rage. This red figure at the column crater from NOLA was initially in Chicago today. Initially was thought to illustrate the madness of Athamas, but was later identified as the single surviving depiction of his megalomaniac brother, Salmoneus, the king of Elis in the Peloponnese. For those who are not familiar with the myth, Salmoneus was styling himself as Zeus and drove around in a chariot, dragging bronze kettles to make thunder and threw torches in the air to imitate lightning. Enraged by his impiety and arrogance, Zeus smote Salmoneus with a thunderbolt and imprisoned him in Tartarus. On the crater, you see Salmoneus wielding a sword on one hand and holding a winged thunderbolt or a thunderbolt on the other, but apparently, obviously, he's not Zeus. And we can see the broken chains from his left angle here and the arm. So he had just broken the chains that constrained him, and also his expression is wild, throws back the head, and so the eyes are wide open. To his left is Iris, the messenger of the Olympus, and to the right is a bewildered female figure, probably his wife. So this punishment, along with the destruction of himself and his kingdom, was the price that he had to pay for impersonating a god. However, the one child of Zeus with whom Hera had the deepest enmity was, of course, Heracles, the greatest of all heroes. Their antagonistic relationship is literally imprinted in the hero's name, which combines the name of the goddess Hera and Kleos, the Greek word for glory. It can be interpreted both ways, to mean either for the glory of Hera or glorious through Hera. And this, the second interpretation, I think, it's more apt, because the glory of Heracles arises from the torments inflicted upon him by the goddess. And that also spares him to accomplish his great deeds. According to tradition, Heracles performed his 12 labors as penance for murdering his own sons after Hera made him temporarily insane. We see his homicidal mania vividly illustrated on this Pestan vase of the mid-4th century BCE, the so-called Madrid crater. The crater depicts a disorderly pile of household items here on the corner, burning on a pyre. Approaching from the right is Heracles, holding one of his sons in his arms as he's about to throw him into the fire. The child reaches out to touch the beard of his father, imploring vainly for mercy. Heracles appears wearing an ornate three-crested helmet with feathers and embellished greaves, but not his signature lion skin, which is an important detail. Before a half-open door, Megara, his wife, here inscribed, flees in terror, striking her chest with one hand and pulling her hair with the other, clearly mourning. Contemplating the horrific scene from above are mania, again inscribed, madness, Iolaos, nephew of Heracles and Artemide. Heracles' aging mother, which appear in a series of windows from left to right. All figures are labor, as I said. But Iolaus' and Artemide's expressions and gestures reveal their emotion. But mania, as you see here in this detail, is looking rather detached and carrying her signature riding crop. And of course, she's portrayed with cropped hair, which is not it's not a typical mode of. It's one of the iconographic details that tells us that she's not a housewife or a respectable woman. So on bases like this, especially the ones from Peston, this is the only actual crater that depicts surviving that depicts this particular myth. But as we see, these personifications of mania are depicted as characters in a theatrical play rather than abstract notions that complement the narrative. So it's more or less they are watching a performance being set up in the upper gallery of a there are secondary characters that are placed behind the hero in the upper story, behind the hero on the main stage. As the similarities with the Euripides' work, the tragedy Heracles Menomenos, the raging mad Heracles, first produced shortly before 415 BC, striking. I don't have time here to go into detail, but what's for our purposes for this talk is to make to stress that in the play, while Heracles is back, celebrates with his family, standing in the courtyard of his house, about to offer a sacrifice, he starts to suffer a series of psychotic episodes in which his absurd behavior indicates a complete detachment from reality. In his mind, he's taking vengeance on Eurystheus by murdering his own sons. He shoots the first boy with a bow, claps the second down, and shoots both Megara and the third son with a single arrow as they are hidden inside. In Euripides' play, he was about to kill his old father too when Athena intervenes to put an end to the slaughter. Taplin, in his book Poets and Plays, asserts that this macabre idea of Heracles killing his family while acting on some delusionary exploits is likely to have been a Euripidean invention, and suggests that the Madrid crater depicts Heracles in this delusional state, like in the play, perhaps imagining that he is sacking a city, which explains his warrior attire and the absence of the lion skin and the burning pyros in the corner. However, the play is not only about insanity and murder, it's also about hope in the face of overwhelming despair. Ultimately, when the hero returned to himself and recognized his terrible deeds, Heracles accepted his fate and renounced the suicidal thoughts that plagued him. As another fact, just to change the topic, as we say it's a form of punishment. For hubris is the most common motif, but another function of gods inflicting men with madness was to protect the followers of a deity from persecution. Resistance to the new cult, persecution of the god and his worshippers, and the god's vengeance and retaliation are themes that appear repeatedly in the regional variations of myths of Dionysus' arrival in the Greek mainland. And there are some regional variations. One of them, of course, is a famous one, is the story of King Lycurgus of Thrace, who, resisting the arrival of the god, pursued all of Dionysus' followers, including the Maenads, and imprisoned them. Apollodorus explains how Dionysus punished the king by driving him insane. Gripped by madness and thinking he was cutting a vine branch, Lycurgus cured his son Dryas by cutting off his arms and legs with an axe. Then he regained his senses. As a result of this ghastly murder, Thrace was stricken with drought and nothing would grow, a curse that, according to the oracle, would continue as long as Lycurgus lived. Dionysus removed the curse after the Thracians used wild horses to kill Lycurgus by rendering his body into pieces. The best known play on the subject was Aeschylus' tragedy Aethonians, which is now lost. There are, however, many representations of the myth that appear on vases that all emphasize the violence and the drama of the story. And I'm showing you here one of the earlier ones, is an Attic red figure vase in Krakow that shows Lycurgus about to kill his son with an axe. You see him coming from the left, and see the boy sitting on the altar imploring him for mercy. Next to him is Dionysus holding a branch of vine above the unfortunate boy, and it says here is an indication of, it's what I could term a visual marker of not only the epiphany of the god, but also the delusional state of Lycurgus. So his madness, that he now, in his mind's eye, he thinks that he's cutting down a vine. This is a pictorial way of they spending showing that delusional state, so that they can make it clear to the viewer. Another characteristic example is a later vase from Apulia, this curator from roof overheads. We see Lycurgus in the facade of a temple-like building again, holding his axe, and the boy, his son Dryas, pleading for mercy, and successfully a figure running away in terror again, dropping his sacrificial basket, and another very evocative figure, probably a companion of Dionysus, a hunting companion, depicted in this grieving what's about to happen. Look up here, in this very unusual figure, also the way it's positioned as a corner acroterium on the temple, is this female figure draped in this, covered with her mantle. Scholars interpret this as a personification of Lisa, of madness, here functioning as an ex machina, so to speak, representative of Dionysus in the story. This is, again, a way of the painter of showing us what's going on, that this is inflicted by the god. It's through divine intervention rather than a cold-blooded, premeditated murder. The subject is popular in Apulian red figure vases, like such as this one I'm showing here, but the Lycurgus painted in the British Museum. But we see again the mad Thracian king here. This time he has already killed his son, which his dead body is being carried away by two attendants, and he's about to attack his wife. Maybe. Or if we, before I go to that, I want to show you here the detail of, look at this. I'm not going to have time to go into the description of all the figures, of course, but this is the figure I want you to pay attention to. Is this flying female figure coming from above, holding kendron here. Okay. And this is the personification of Lysa. This is in Greek, or Lita in Attic. This is what's in Latin is ira or furor. And of course, this would translate today's mad rage, fury. And Lysa, even in modern Greek today, means rabbis too. And this is very interesting Attic that figure Bell created in Boston, MFA, which is one of the very noteworthy representation of this personification. You see here, named up here. It's the figure of Lysa. It's very different from the later vase, or actually most of the representations, because she doesn't have wings and has this Thracian dress and this alopeki, or this fox head hat. So what is he doing there? The myth is Deuce's madness to Actaeon, killed by his own hounds, and he's in the middle of the transformation. Just to continue with the story, as I said, it's very popular in South Italian vases. Here again, another representation. You see the dead wife, and it's interesting here is Dionysus himself appears in the scene. On the one hand, sort of ordering in a way, or invoking the female figure that has very similar, as you see, the iconography between the Furies and the Erinies are very similar. So it can be either interpreted as a Fury or as a Lysa. And of course, in later depictions of the story, especially like later Roman mosaics, it's mostly a female nymph, ambrosia, that is depicted, rather than the emphasis on that, rather than the sun. And again, we see again Dionysus appearing from the sun. Of course, the most famous story is that, one of the most famous stories is that of the madness of Agave, the mother of King Pentheus in Thebes. And I'm showing you one of the most harrowing representations of the story of this Dionysiac wrath and revenge. This great figure, Helix, which is attributed to Doris as a painter. Dates about 480, so it's an early classical. Depicts the Theban women tearing the young king to pieces, a very graphic illustration of the story. This macabre is a theater that goes all around the vase. So we see on the one side the two main protagonists tearing him, holding the torso of the unfortunate king, and then of course each of the minas carrying a body part. And continues on the other side, which we see the god Dionysus sitting around, surrounded by these revelers serenely on his chair, and looking back at the satyr who plays the double flute. There's another less savage representation of the same nymph, is this like an islet that now in the look, that's focused on the Ino and Agave as the protagonist. So that's about to start the dismemberment of Pentheus. Of course, the topic is popular with the Roman wall paintings, and I'm showing you an example from the House of the Fete in Paideia. It's a Roman fresco. In this case, it's only the minutes that are represented, and this is how it is placed in the actual wall. I think I'm running out of time. I don't know how much we're doing in time, so I'm gonna leave the house of Cadmus, which it's the one that like the ample source of inspiration for the tragedian, but also for the vase paint as another artist. And go to the last topic that I'm going to touch upon. Of course, there are many more myths, and I don't have time to go over them that are related and to the subject. It's a huge, interesting subject. For example, I think I'm not talking about minas, maybe some surprised. Like, are the female groups that usually females is an interesting thing. In these myths are portrayed as going mad in groups, so not as isolated instances as most men are. So that's another interesting topic, side topic to be explored. So we have the Protives, the kings of the daughters of the kings Proitos of Art. We have, of course, the Kekropides, the sons of the daughters of Kekros, and the story of Erythron and but I'm going to skip that and go to the last topic that is related to this narrative of madness in Greek art is, of course, suicide and suicidal depression. Suicide is yet another grim consequence of madness. Comes even more devastating when, this is the case in this Greek myth, is the insanity is temporary. And the decision to end one's life is then becomes, in the case of Ajax, inescapable, so becomes the only rational choice. That's why it's the hero Ajax, Aias in Greek, and his disgrace and subsequent suicide on his sword that exemplifies this link between temporary madness and suicide. Of course, as we all know, it was staged most famously by Sophocles in the homonymous play Aias, sometime in the late 440s. In the play, he so maybe I'll say the place for people may not know. So the play, as we know, begins in medias res, so in the middle of it, with Athena explaining Ajax's madness to Odysseus, who had previously won out over Ajax in a dispute to acquire Achilles' arms. That's the cause of his anger. Ajax becomes enraged, in a delirium slaughters livestock, thinking that they were Greeks, even brings a ram to his tent and tortures it, believing the animal to be Odysseus. So in the play, we know Athena intervened to change his consciousness, so in order to direct his fury away from the Achaeans. When he regains his senses, he's horrified. His Trojan consort, the Tecmessa, tries to calm him down, but with no success, so he leaves. A messenger forecasts that if Ajax leaves the tent, he will die. Therefore, a siege begins for the hero. In the meantime, Ajax commits suicide by falling on his sword. Menelaus proclaims that Ajax's body should be left for the birds. Odysseus argues then that Ajax should be honored and he's to be buried as a hero, and that's kind of the snapshot, the plot of the play. Of course, much earlier than that is this black figure amphora, attributed to Exekias of about 430 BC, one of his most famous vase paintings. And we see here a very evocative representation of this suicide, the hero planting his sword just moments before he falls in. I should mention that, so you see the detail of his representation of the famous, that although the suicide of Ajax is a popular theme in vase painting, most of this, as I said, predate the tragedy of Sophocles. They only saw the act of suicide itself or its aftermath. There's no surviving depiction of the manic episode, the hallucinatory episode that preceded it, which can be incidental. We're not certain about that. So if you compare this scene with a later vase of his suicide, again in Basil's red figure vase, we see the difference between the two. With the exiguous rendition, the anticipated drama of the act of suicide unfolds in silent preparation. So it's anticipated on the lithophos, it culminates in the tormented face and supplicating gesture of the hero. The interior of this red figure cup depicts the grim aftermath. Ajax is impaled on his sword, and Tecmessa rushes to cover the dead body. He lies supine with his head and long hair thrown back, and beneath him the ground is drawn to resemble the pebble beach where the hero went to die. The scene on the tomb of the cup recalls Tecmessa's speech in the play. He must not be seen. I will cover his body. I will wrap him completely in my mantle. No one who loved him could bear to see the dark blood pouring from his nostrils and the raw wound in his breast. Sophocles was keenly aware of the moral issues in human actions and the powers that operate through time and fortune on human affairs. In his plays, the self and external reality are clearly distinguished and delineated. In fact, he was one of the first to look at madness as a psychological phenomenon in its own right, having realized that the madman lives in a world constructed by his mind that does not correspond with any external reality, natural or supernatural. So in Ajax, the hero undergoes the first known case of individual alienation, as he can look upon himself and see the revelation of his madness. The resulting anguish is yet another form of alienation that sickens him, a malady that in his eyes can be remedied only with a sword. Ajax is great but proud and uncompromising hero. He refuses Athena's help by claiming that, unlike lesser mortals, he does not need the help of the gods. So the traditional interpretation of the play is that Ajax commits hubris by rejecting and insulting Athena, which sets the stage for his downfall. However, as Peter observes, in Ajax, Sophocles prefigures ambiguities about the etiology of madness and deviant behavior. We see in the play the emergence of such notions as personality defect, the role of voluntary choice, and the will to madness, as well as the belief that madness is due to an involuntary determinism due to extra psychic forces. In conclusion, one can sum up by saying that the troubled mental states and inner psychological conflicts, of course, are very difficult to render by pictorial means alone. However, the dramatic narrative power and the visual apparatus of Greek myths of madness come to the rescue. Real-life behaviors of and actions toward the madman, as well as the literary stereotypes of the wandering or stone-throwing madman, are not depicted in art. On South Italian vases, in particular, personifications such as Mania and Lisa appear as secondary characters in the theatrical plays rather than being actively involved in the narrative. Madness is then expressed through acts of violence and murder. Painters distinguish these manic episodes from violence in the battlefield or cold-blooded crimes by using visual markers of disassociation. These are, for example, the epiphany of the god or the personification that causes the mania, the distorted poses and frantic gestures signifying intense emotions of both the inflicted and the spectators, as we saw in some of the vases, such as the grief and the horrified disbelief of the onlookers. We see how this pathos formula, to use the term by Abby Warburg, the Pathos Formula, in the depictions of the Minas, for example, or this didn't show you examples here, in ecstatic frenzy, the loose or cropped hair, the disheveled garments, or the tossed back heads. As I said, for this is just a preliminary study of the visual material of this fascinating topic of the narratives of madness and insanity in the ancient world, and I'm afraid it raises more questions than it provides answers. I hope, however, that it does illustrate some of the historical and cultural underpinnings of attitudes towards mental illness and cognitive disabilities today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kiki. I'm going to give everyone the option to unmute themselves in case there are any questions. You can also, if you prefer, just raise your hand or write your question in the chat, and then I'll read it out for Kiki. Any questions at all from anyone? I had a thought, Kiki, about, I've been thinking lately about the concept of generational guilt or historical guilt, which I feel is sort of abroad in our own society right now. You know, and I've experienced before, like those of us who spend time in Germany, of course, know this cultural phenomenon where a culture is sort of affected by the sins of its fathers, and it was I guess it's more of an observation than a question, but if you can think of anything more to say about it, I'd be curious to hear. I was very interested to see that portrayed as a form of madness in Greek culture, because it is very hard to cope sort of rationally with situations like that, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And this is, I mean, this is how also, thank you for this question. This is how Orestes, the story of the case of Orestes is a little different from the other ones, in the sense that when he commits the murder of his mother, he's conscious. He's not in some delusional state. So it's a premeditated murder. But of course, the grief, the guilt is so intense that he cannot survive it. That's why he becomes inflicted with this, we call it madness or mania, because it's unbearable. And of course, later on, that's not the and then of course the Menides the Furies become Menides, and he gets purified by Apollo and is kind of absolved of the sin. But this is why this play is interesting, because it raises deep issues of can real justice be ever done, or was the issue of retaliation and vengeance? How is this regulated in a democratic society? This is like the Orestes is still very topical play. And actually, I don't know, someone who you are in New York is coming up, and I'm not connected with them in any way, but this was funny because I was like, not funny, it was interesting that I was preparing the talk. I came up, they were going to show the Orestes at the Park Avenue Armory. They're going to stage the three plays, but in the modern, contemporary adaptation is one. So it's about a long performance. I got my ticket, so I'll let you know afterwards if I got it.
Right. Alan Shapiro is next. Hi, Alan. Nice to see you.
Hi. Thank you, Kiki. That was really interesting. And I'm also looking forward to that Orestes. I just had a comment on that Boston crater with Lisa that you read as an alopecia on her head. I had always understood that to be a rabid dog growing out of her head to sort of increase the sense of madness. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah,
idea.
it looks very much like the dogs that it seems like in choreography, but the people that think that it's an alopekis might be either or. That is not, we don't know for sure. But the alopeki story is the fact that because she's dressed like a Thracian,
Right.
so the hunting attire.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's another indication, I think, it's of the fact that most of these figures are quote unquote foreigners or non-Athenian. Of course, we can make a generalization like that because we have, and I didn't have time for this, and you know it very well, of course, because of your own work. It's like we have the suicide of the daughters of Kekros right on the Acropolis. So it's something that afflicts Athenian too. It's not madness, it's not a condition of the foreign and the strange and the barbarous. It's interesting to see that. That's why it would be interesting to kind of, and I think Evridi Kefalid also wrote an article on this, briefly touched upon this, the topic of how for me it's interesting to see that when women are afflicted, of course we know the means, and that was not, I didn't go into detail about this. But these are all groups of women that are afflicted in an ensemble, in a community together. Well, most of the cases that involve men are isolated cases, like is the lone madman.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next up is William Tortorelli.
Thank you. Thanks for the great survey of all of these images. I've been concerned with madness for a long time. And I find it difficult to distinguish between images of Pentheus and of Orpheus, both being torn apart by scary women. I was thinking particularly of the painting from Pompeii in the House of the Vetii. How do you name this as Pentheus rather than Orpheus? Are there any indications of the madness of the subject, of him?
The difference is, and I haven't done the research specifically for the Roman paintings, but from the Greek materials, we know, of course, that the vase paintings all situate the Orpheus myth in Thrace. So the perpetrators are the Thracian women. They are dressed in the garments are specific, and they always use weapons of any sort. Whereas in most cases, in the case of Pentheus and the Bacchae and the Minas, they are not, the only thing they carry is they either use their bare hands, right? Or the only weapon, who's not even a weapon, is the thyrsus. So they never use real weapons. So it's kind of the idea is that their frenzy and ecstasy, religious ecstasy is so great that they kind of, in a way, gives them supernatural power so that they can do that. Of course, this is also connected with the ritual of homophagia, and this is a huge discussion. But with Orpheus, usually it's the women, and in the myth, at least, we know that this was not done in the fit of madness or rage. This was done in a premeditated manner because they were angry at him, right? So this is a difficulty, and most of the painters, I mean, some of the painters were more successful in showing this than others. How do you make it clear, the distinction, when the symptoms of this affliction are invisible? I mean, we can do much. And I don't know if I answered the question, I'm not going to rabble on. There are iconographic details that tells us we can distinguish it. Well, maybe Dr. Shapiro can.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It doesn't seem that there are other questions, which is good because I have to go.
I'm sorry, you ran longer than it should have been.
Oh no, it was very interesting, and it's no problem. But I have I can hear my daughter calling.
No worries,
calling me to lunch. So I just want to thank you, Kiki, for this wonderful talk, and thank you all for attending. Tune in next month we've just confirmed that Harvard's Kathy Coleman is going to be talking next month about the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae, which is a fascinating institution in Germany that's been writing a Latin dictionary for 200 years or something like that. So thank you to everyone. I hope you have a great Sunday. And thanks again, Kiki. And yeah, take care. All right.
Bye.
Bye.